At this point, if you've watched the first seasons of our Archives series on Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm, you'll be fairly familiar with the leading men of those two stories, Walt Disney and Walter Knott. We've talked about them separately, but today, I want to talk about them side by side. This episode of Sightlines is going to be a bit different. We usually look at theme parks on this show. Today, we're looking at their creators. We'll compare Walt and Walter and see how their lives were similar and different, and see what conclusions we can draw about what it takes to be a pioneer in theme parks. Clearly, being named Walter doesn't hurt. It's hard not to be captivated by the fact that these two men shared a name. But how odd is it, really? What if the name was the most popular in the years they were born? As it turns out, according to US Census data, Walter was the 13th and 12th most popular name in 1889 and 1901 respectively. This corresponds to names like Justin for men born in the 80s or David for men born in the 90s or aughts. So it's not the most common name, but still relatively popular. And given the name's sustained popularity over the 11 years between their births, it's probably not too incredible that they shared a first name. It was certainly a far more popular name than today, where it's fallen out of the top 250. So what? These two men, founders of two of the earliest theme parks, shared a name. Big deal. But the demographic similarities don't end there. Both men were born in the first half of December, just 5 days apart, and both died in the first half of December as well, within 10 days of their birthdays. That's coincidental. I mean, all things being equal, there's a 1 in 12 chance to die in the same month as you were born, but all things aren't equal. The winter months have a higher mortality rate, and since the United States is in the northern hemisphere, that means December through February. Birth rates by month are less clear. They vary greatly based on how close to the equator the parents live. This means that Walt Disney's December birth in Chicago was more uncommon than Walter Knott's in Southern California. But these two things, the shared name and month of birth and death, they're just quirks of trivia. They're intriguing, but neither really tells us anything about these men. Besides, there are innumerable attributes they potentially shared that mean nothing for who they were or what they accomplished. For example, they both may have preferred coffee over tea, or carrots over peas. We'll leave those kinds of trivialities aside and try to focus on more useful information about what they had in common and what made them different. Walter Knott and Walt Disney were both from relatively poor families. They both worked as children, helping support the household with the money they brought in. Both showed a fondness for a simple, rural farming lifestyle from an early age. Both were less interested in school than in pursuing their dreams, farming for Knott and drawing for Disney. Both made an attempt at self-starting their dream in their early 20s and failed. Knott tried to farm a homestead out in the Mojave Desert, but ended up taking odd jobs until the contract to acquire the land ran out. Then he left, leaving the land as desolate today as when he acquired it over a century ago. Walt Disney launched an animation studio with Ub Iwerks in Kansas City, only to go bankrupt and move to California with barely anything to his name. Both men were highly reliant on family for their early success. Aside from his brother Roy handling all of the studio's business concerns, Disney also benefited from a generous loan from a wealthy uncle, which helped him launch the first California-based studio over on Hyperion. Walter Knott, on the other hand, relied on cousins to help him find work in the farming business. It was by going into business with one of these cousins that he first leased the land that would become the home of his ghost town and eventually theme park. Both Walt and Walter held relatively conservative political views and were supporters of the Republican Party. That said, both seem to have been more interested in the party's pro-business platforms than in social issues. They were also both strident anti-communists, not too surprising for the Cold War era, given their fairly conservative views. But neither really dictated their life around their politics. Choosing to live in Southern California was a good choice for both men. They each found their fortune within 20 miles of Los Angeles. And of course, they owned and operated their theme parks about 5 miles away from each other. Both men were in their 50s when they started building what would become their theme parks. Knott started the ghost town in 1940, the year after his 50th birthday. Disney was 52 when they broke ground for Disneyland. And both men had successful careers before they began working on their parks, Disney in film, Knott in berry farming and chicken dinner restauranting. The two men seemed to share a cordial relationship, though how close they actually were is unclear. It's pretty obvious Disney quite enjoyed Knott's ghost town and respected Walter for having built it with more passion than money. On the other hand, it's not as clear if Walter Knott was as much of a fan of Disney's work. There don't seem to be any reliable sources where he expressed a distaste for Disney's films or television programs, and any time he was asked about the man, Knott was gracious and complimentary. But Walter Knott doesn't really strike me as a movie buff or a fan of animation. If he was a fan of Disney's work, it seems more than likely it was because of his kids, who were the perfect ages to grow up with the Disney classics of the 20s and 30s. There are others, but those are the biggest similarities between Walt and Walter. So let's look at some of the biggest differences between them. Probably the most consequential is that Walter Knott was 11 years older. This meant that while Walt Disney was just a little too young to serve on the front lines in World War I, Walter Knott was too old. He was already in his late 20s, married, and had 3 kids. Walter Knott was also the eldest child with only one brother. Walt Disney was the next to youngest of 5 kids and the youngest son. Knott was actually born in between Walt's eldest 2 brothers. Knott's father passed away when he was little. Both of Disney's parents survived into his adulthood and lived to see his success as a studio owner. While both men were parents, the Knotts had twice as many kids. Walter Knott grew up in Southern California back when the movie business was still considered a fad. The area outside of Los Angeles was mostly rural farmland. Knott was raised in small towns that had more in common with Disney's Marceline than modern LA. Walt Disney, on the other hand, may have cherished his time in Marceline, but it was brief. Most of his childhood and adolescence were spent in big cities like Chicago and Kansas City. Both men married in their early 20s, though under significantly different circumstances. Knott married his high school sweetheart. Disney married an employee of his studio. And while Cordelia Knott was highly involved in the work on the farm and ran the eventual chicken dinner restaurant, Lillian Disney's legacy to the Disney Company centers more around how she inspired Walt and his stories, rather than any direct work she did for the studio. Walt Disney was still in his 20s when he found success with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, receiving a special Oscar for the effort. He was a multimillionaire and international celebrity before he was 40. Meanwhile, Walter Knott was a relatively poor farmer into his middle age. It was only after he turned 50 that he could even afford to start investing in the ghost town and building his park. Knott was a deeply religious man and went to church every Sunday. Disney was more circumspect in talking about his personal religious beliefs, but it is pretty well known that he didn't attend church regularly, though his daughters and wife did. Despite holding similar views, their political involvement was significantly different. Knott was very active in politics later in life, after the establishment of his theme park. While Disney testified in front of Congress and stumped for a few candidates before building his park, his political career was short-lived, and overall he was far less involved in politics than Walter Knott. Funnily enough, both men were friends of Ronald Reagan. Disney when he was still just an actor, Knott when he was the governor of California and eventually president. Walter Knott died at 91 years old, a week before his 92nd birthday, after living with Parkinson's for years. His death, though sad, wasn't a surprise and came at the end of a long, fulfilling life. He had retired years ago, handing over command of his theme park to his youngest daughter, Marion. Walt Disney died at 65, a little over a week after his birthday, of lung cancer. While he'd been sick for some time, he'd kept it somewhat quiet, meaning the world, and most people working for his company, were shocked at the news of his death. He left many projects, including his experimental prototype Community of Tomorrow, unfinished and leaderless. As with the similarities we listed, there were, of course, many other ways the lives of Knott and Disney diverged. These were the most important and point to some of the qualities that don't really seem to have made much of a difference to their success. For example, being raised in the city or country doesn't seem to have been all that important, nor does being from a single-parent household or having a lot of siblings. So let's extrapolate and look at a few of the more valuable lessons we can take from these two men. Obviously, with only 2 examples to draw from, these lessons have to be pretty broad. And they are more suggestions to consider than actual life advice. Number 1, coming from poverty isn't a complete roadblock, but having a family that can help you out makes it a lot easier to escape. Know when to ask for help. 2, education is important, but school performance doesn't define your life. 3, start working young. Fail early. Learn lessons, then try again. 4, don't give up on your dreams, but don't be too rigid in what you consider success either. Sometimes it's better to start serving chicken dinners than keep farming berries, or make animation rather than try to become a live-action director. 5, believe what you believe, but spend your time trying to entertain people rather than trying to convert them to your beliefs. 6, success isn't something that comes overnight, and it isn't the sole property of the young. You can become successful at 50, and can still have 40 years to enjoy the fruits of that success, if you take care of yourself. Which leads us to the last one, number 7, chain smoking probably isn't good for your health or longevity. There are probably some other good pieces of advice to find in looking at what made these 2 men successful, but this is where we'll stop for today. If you have some ideas of your own, tell us about them in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this special episode of Sightlines, and also this past year of shows on the channel. The 1st of next month, October, is our 1-year anniversary here at Theme Parchive. We hope to see you then. Hey friends, thanks for watching all the way to the end of this video. Here's a couple more you might like, and if you would, please hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up. It literally costs you nothing except a few seconds, and it truly helps us make more videos like this one. An extra special thanks go out to the people helping us over on Patreon. It's because of their support that you're seeing this video right now. If you want to help the channel out even more, head over to our Patreon and check it out. You can find it through a link in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we hope you have a great day.